We're going to continue graphing logs. This time we're going to focus on natural log. And what we have to remember is that natural log is log base e. Now, since it's the base, remember the two numbers that we want on our table is 1 and the base. Now, since all of these are natural log, then that means that the base is going to be e. Now, what we have to remember is that e is 2.718 and it continues, but we're just going to use the number 2.7. And the reason why is because we're going to be plotting a point, and whether it's 2.7 or 2.718, it's really not going to make much of a difference when we're plotting the point. So we're just going to use 2.7 to make it easier for us. As a reminder, our vertical asymptote is always the h, which is the opposite of what's inside the parenthesis. Now remember, it has to be inside of a parenthesis. If there's no h or there's no parenthesis, then it's just going to be 0. So we see that with the first one. We have our vertical asymptote, and it's going to be 0. Then we do our table of values. We have 1, and we have e. And remember, we're using the number 2.7 for e. When we plug in a 1, natural log of 1 is 0, times 3 is 0. If we plug in a 2.7, 2.7 natural log, remember that's just e, so it has a common base, and it becomes 1. 3 times 1 is 3. So when we graph this, what we have is our vertical asymptote at 0. And then we plot our point, which is 1, 0, and 2.7 and 3. We're going to also state our domain and range. And for our domain, what we have is whatever our asymptote is. In this case, it's 0 to infinity. And then for our range, what it's going to be is negative infinity to infinity. For our next one, we're going to find our vertical asymptote. Once again, no parentheses, so that means that it's going to be 0. When we do our table of values, since we don't have any parentheses, we're going to do the same. We have 1 and we have e, which is, we're going to abbreviate as 2.7. When we plug in a 1, natural log of 1 is always 0, so negative 0 plus 2 is 2. When we plug in a 2.7, the bases are the same, so it becomes 1. But since that negative makes it negative 1, so negative 1 plus 2 gives us a 1. So we have our vertical asymptote at 0. We have our point, which is 1, 2, and 2.7 and 1. And what we have is our graph, our domain, once again, 0 to infinity, and our range is always the same, negative infinity to infinity. Looking at the next one, we're going to start off with our vertical asymptote. So our vertical asymptote is going to be x is equal to negative 2, because this is what gives us a 0. Then we're going to have our table of values, and we have to think a little bit through this one. It's not just going to be 1 and e. What we have to do is figure out what gives us a 1. So what number plus 2 gives us 1, and that would be negative 1. And what gives us a 2.7 is just going to be 0.7. So if we plug in a negative 1 plus 2 is 1. And of course, the natural log of 1 is 0. Minus 1 is negative 1. If we plug in a 0.7, 0.7 plus 2 is 2.7. So the bases are the same. We get 1 minus 1, which is 0. So we have our vertical asymptote at negative 2. Then what we have is -1, -1. We have 0.7 and 0. And this right here gives us our graph. So if we're looking at our domain goes from -2 to infinity. And then if we're looking at our range, it's going to be -infinity to infinity. So if we're looking at our next ones, what we have is our vertical asymptote. And so our vertical asymptote is going to be x is equal to 0. And then what we have is our table of values, which are going to be 1 and 2.7. So when we plug in a 1, it becomes 0. 2 times 0 is 0. If we plug in a 2.7, bases cancel. We get 1. 1 times 2 is 2. We have our vertical asymptote at 0. We have 1, 0. And we have 2.7 and 2. Our domain start at our vertical asymptote, which is 0 to infinity. Our range is always going to be the same for logarithms, -infinity to infinity. So for the next one, we have parentheses. So our vertical asymptote is a little bit trickier. We have to figure out what gives us a 0. In this case, it's 1. So x is equal to 1. We're going to do our table of values. So what we have is what gives us a 1, and that, of course, would be 2. And then what gives us a 2.7, which would be 3.7. So if we plug in a 2, 2 minus 1 is 1. Natural log of 1 is 0. If we plug in a 3.7, 3.7 minus 1 is 2.7. So the bases are the same, and it becomes 1. We have our vertical asymptote at 1. And then what we have is 2, 0, and 3.7 and 1. So our domain, it goes from 1 to infinity, and then our range is going to be -infinity to infinity. For our last one, once again, we have parentheses. So that means our vertical asymptote is what gives us 0 inside the parenthesis. So in that case, it would be x is equal to -1. We're going to do our table of values. So with our table of values, it's what gives us 1 and the base, which of course is e, which is 2.7. So what gives us a 1 is 0, and what gives us a 2.7 is 1.7. So when we plug it in, 0 plus 1 is 1. That, of course, is 0 minus 2 is -2. 1.7 plus 1 is 2.7. Bases are the same, so it's 1 minus 2, which is -1. We have our vertical asymptote at -1. We have our points 0, -2, and 1.7 and -1. So with our domain, we have -1 to infinity. And then with our range, it's -infinity to infinity.